I played a chess tournament recently against some of the strongest chess players I think I've ever played against. It was the Chess Nova Scotia Labor Day Open 2024. And let me just show you my browser window real quick here. This is the open section, which I played in. And you can see I'm way down here. Number 22 out of 31. And my rating with CFC is 1536 going into this tournament. And my first couple of games, I actually played a couple of players who were lower rated than me, and those games went pretty well. And then for the remaining 3 rounds of the tournament, I played against people all from this range, sort of the 1750 to 1850 range. And they were really tough games. So I'd like to show you through them. Let me switch back here to my other browser window and show you the board. All right, so let's jump into round 1, which was pretty good. It was around a 1400 opponent, so I knew going into it that I was higher rated, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. I still have to earn the win if I'm going to win this game. So here it is. I am an e4 player these days, and my opponent played e6, the French defense, to which I sighed inside a little bit. I don't really like the French defense. I really need to learn some theory or something interesting against the French. Right now, what I do is I play the King's Indian attack against the French, which is perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine response to the French defense. I don't really know what I'm doing with it. Like, I know the King's Indian because I play it as black, and so I kind of try to just use some of the same ideas. But basically, I just kind of get my setup and make it up as I go from there, which is fine. It often performs pretty well, but I should probably learn something more specifically against the French. Anyway, so get the fianchetto set up. We get castled. Pretty typical King's Indian sort of setup. And at this point, I'm thinking maybe I can even play for e5 at some point here. So I was considering like putting the rook there and then threatening that fork right away. I don't really know about taking in this position. I think it just, I don't know. I didn't want to be too hasty to take. But then what happened is black played e5 rather. So kind of shuts down my idea of playing e5. Now this does weaken this pawn, and I didn't like the idea of capturing it right away because I felt like it just gives black sort of too much activity right away. Maybe I can plant that knight there, but if I don't, then this pawn is potentially coming, especially if there's a rook behind it. Let me go back here. So instead, I just moved the rook over, potentially putting some extra pressure on this pawn if this one ever were to trade off. And we went from there. Now, when the bishop comes here, I don't always feel really great about chasing it away, but I decided to do so in this case. And I don't know. It would be interesting to know sort of, I don't know whether this is theory. I guess I should have looked at these moves, but I just decided I didn't want that bishop to be there. I wanted to ask the question, basically, what's that bishop going to do? Are you going to take the knight or not? And when they didn't take the knight, I decided, okay, this setup is okay. Like, I'm definitely weakening my king, but if I can keep the center more or less closed, then this bishop is just not doing very well. So I don't know that this was the correct way to play this opening, but it promised an interesting game at least. I put the knight there either to attack the bishop or potentially to put it on that outpost. But I want the knight to be there I want it to be pretty temporary, right? Because the knight is on the edge and it's not really doing much right there. It's potentially going to be under fire soon. So black played bishop c5, kind of hitting this pawn and pinning it. I play knight b3, kicking that bishop back. And then I played bishop e3. And this is a mistake, but it's a mistake because it's a miss, actually. It turns out in this position, there is a tactic. So feel free to pause the video here for a second and see if you can find it. But the move is g5. And g5 kicks this knight away. The knight can go here or here. It can't go to either of these squares because of the queen. And of course, this pawn is defended. And then once the knight is kicked away, I have a pawn and a bishop attacking this pawn. And so it's a tactic that wins a pawn right there. I missed that tactic. I instead played here with a couple of ideas. Challenging this bishop, for sure. If the bishop comes down and trades, then I think what I was thinking during the game was actually recapturing with this pawn and having a really strong center. But I was actually kind of baiting this move. And the engine doesn't love this. I think the engine says that black is actually a little bit better, or it's about 0. It's 0.0 here, actually. But I like this because this puts me in familiar King's Indian territory. With the center locked like this in the King's Indian setup, it means often you start a kingside attack. And this is what happened. So black did play this move. Whoops. And I came back, and now I'm thinking, all right, these pawns are already pushed, so let's attack on that side of the board. Black played knight d7, which hits this knight, and so I decide now it's time to put the knight there. I could have captured, but I didn't really like opening up that file for black, so I decided to put it here, and then when black trades, which they did, I can capture here, and then I potentially have this G file to use as part of my attack. The engine doesn't like this idea. The engine thinks that I should have gone this way and started putting pressure down the center instead, which that also makes a lot of sense. But I was already kind of committed to this idea of the kingside attack, and so this is what I went for. What I hadn't really seen here is this move, queen h4, which is a pretty nice defensive resource for black, actually, because my queen kind of wants to come over here or here, right, to assist in the attack. The rook wants to come over and so on. And this queen kind of blocks out some of these squares that my queen could potentially come to. Now, I, at some point, could move my queen to g4 and trade them off, and then I have some pawns that can march down the board, so that might come a little bit later. For now, I placed my queen on f3, thinking that, you know, the trade could be coming. I could put it here, but I'm probably going to move ahead with my plan of getting a rook onto the g file. Black played g6, and I don't think g6 was a good move. I guess maybe it was a little bit of hope chess, thinking if I just quickly take that pawn, then, whoops, if I take that pawn, then it opens up the f-file hitting my queen. But I did not take that pawn. I just felt like this was sort of an unnecessary weakening of the king. And so I moved my king off of the g-file so that if black takes here and opens up the g-file themselves, I can get my rook onto that file more quickly. And then black played knight e7. I guess trying to add pressure here, or maybe seeing kind of the kingside attack coming and wanting to bring some pieces over. During the game, I actually was pretty worried about knight f6, partly because it covers this square, and so I no longer have the option of offering the queen trade, which at this point I was thinking I was going to want to offer the queen trade at some point. I don't remember exactly why. Like it feels like since I'm trying to attack, I should keep the queens on the board. But I just felt like if, you know, some things opened up and something came under fire, I could potentially be in control of when this queen trade happened. And especially if I have a rook here, I can start to put some nice pressure. So I was worried about f6, but I could actually, in this position, I think, for one thing, I think rook g1 here is actually just fine. But I can also still offer a queen trade with queen g3. And the queen trade here is actually basically forced because this queen can't go here because of the bishop. If the queen goes here, then I actually trap it. And so once the queen trade happens, now I have an even better pawn structure for attacking on the king side. So yeah, I feel like I shouldn't have been worried about knight f6, but because I was worried about knight f6, I ended up, sorry, didn't go back far enough. What happened in the game, black didn't play knight f6, black played knight e7 instead, and I offered the queen trade right away. Again, because for some reason that I'm struggling to remember at this point, I was worried about knight f6, and so I wanted to just get this done before knight f6 prevented it. So for better or for worse, this is what happened. I don't think it was completely accurate play on my part. Turns out that in this position, actually, rook g1 is quite strong. And it has a couple of ideas. If black ever opens up here, then I actually have this discovered attack on the king. They can block, but then I can pick up this pawn, and my attack is feeling pretty good. And what was the other thing? If the king moves off of the g file once the rook goes here, then I can still open this up. And if black opens up now, then and probably they wouldn't, but there's this bishop move potentially in the air, forking the queen and the knight, which is nice. So having this rook there would have been an asset. I think actually the engine even prefers pulling the bishop back here. One issue in this position is that this light squared bishop is pretty terrible and it's kind of awkwardly just in the way. I think I was thinking, if I move it back this way, then I can potentially put it here and maybe it can offer some kind of assistance on my attack. I'm not sure. In any case, none of that happened. We traded queens, and then the knight came to f6 finally. I moved the bishop here. I sort of wanted it on this diagonal anyway, and now it's out of the way of this g file and also defending this pawn. And then black blundered. So once again, pause the video here if you'd like and see if you can find the move. But this is where the game pretty much ended. Like, not entirely, but it was pretty much over at this point because there's a tactic here that wins material for white. And so the move is g5. g5 hits this knight, which forces it to move away. And they actually didn't move the knight away in the game, but say they move the knight there, then f6 is a check defended by a pawn and wins that knight. So seeing that, what they did was actually take this pawn. I took the knight, they took that pawn. I recaptured here, which incidentally opens up this diagonal, and so they had to defend against that. Moved this bishop here, so it's a bit more out of the way. Kind of defending that pawn, but not really because it has two attackers. And then black took this pawn. And so when the dust settled on all of these trades, I won I'm up a bishop for 2 pawns. So I am up material, only 1 point of material, but the king is also like way out in the open. This pawn should be weak in the end game, and I was actually feeling pretty good here. So my thought in this position was that I should start trading things down. So I felt like, let's get into an end game. I'm up material. If I can maintain the bishop pair, then the more I can open things up, the stronger my bishop pair is going to be. And this bishop is still quite horrible. This bishop's been sitting here all game, hiding behind these pawns, and so I should be in a winning position here. And the engine gives this +3, +3.2, 3.3, something like this. So it's basically winning for white, and I was feeling pretty good here. So I managed to convert the win. I grabbed that file, traded 1 pair of rooks, offered to trade the other pair of rooks, and then black tried to black tried to put the knight in the way, but this seemed like an inaccuracy to me because it just allows me to put my bishop here. and attack that knight. Now, I actually didn't do this right away. I moved the bishop to g5 first, which pushes the king out of the way, and then I attack the knight with a tempo. Sorry, spoiler alert, with a tempo because the king has to come back and defend it. And if the king came back and defended it, then I would just simply take and trade the rooks and then bring my king and maybe support that the f pawn to push or something like this. And I felt like this was going to be totally winning for white. Yeah, still +3 or so, according to the engine. Black tried to get creative instead and pushed this pawn, sort of counterattacking this bishop. And I suppose if I capture the pawn, then they can maybe capture my bishop, but then the rook is hanging, and then they get that bishop. So it was sort of a potentially tricky little exchange here, but I calculated and figured out that I can just take the knight. And now rook takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and I'm actually up another pawn at this point, another point of material. So I'm actually up a knight for a pawn. So black plays c5. I didn't want my knight to get attacked, so I put it there with the idea of going here eventually. And with this move, I saw that b5 was possible, kicking my knight if I went here, so I played a4 to prevent that. Black played a5. I put the knight here. Now I am putting some pressure on the e-pawn. Black plays b6. I bring my king to support this push. And then I think black was just trying to find something, trying to make this bishop more active, but ended up hanging this pawn. And now there's a bit of a trick here because this square is covered, but I figured, okay, I can just blockade with my king. And so I do this push. I push again. And then I think black basically just miscalculated here because I can trade the bishops, and now the king can't come to this square. I'm assuming that in this position, that's what black wanted, is to trade the bishops and then put the king on this square attacking my backwards pawn. But they can't because the knight is defending. So we traded. I moved my king over here to blockade this pawn, and now this pawn is going to fall. There's no way to defend it, and black resigned. So it was a good game. It was, for me, a great way to start the tournament. It's always nice to start it off on a win. And, you know, pretty good opening, not fantastic. But then when there was a tactic that won me material, then I found it. I managed to get up material and then traded down to a winning endgame. So switch back to this view. So yeah, I was pretty happy with how the tournament started off. I didn't feel like my play was perfect, but I felt like it was good enough for my level. And so stay tuned for the rest of the videos. There are 4 rounds to go. I'll be shooting round 2 pretty soon. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.